Welcome everybody to our first Healios Spotlight interview with Dr Duncan Law. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you.
Just before we get going, I'd like to remind people to turn off their cameras and their audios. If you accidentally turn on your camera or your audio, I think we'll turn it off for you, so don't panic. So, Duncan, welcome to Tileyard.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I think the first thing, just in terms of emotion check, that I'm excited and nervous in equal measure. It's really nice being here, and it's really nice being here in Tileyard, and it's really nice being face to face with someone. It's rather than kind of looking at someone on a screen. Yeah. But it's still very nerve-wracking, isn't it? And the exciting bit, apart from being here in the interview, is that as I was coming in today, I remembered that I lived, kind of 100 yards up the road, literally around the corner, nearly 35 years ago. And when this was a part of London where you would just not dream of coming, it was a kind of dangerous part of the world.
Yes.
And it made me, it made me sort of reminisce a little bit about that time when I just moved down to London, moved into the first flat with my girlfriend, Catherine, who's now my wife, and was thinking about how all that sort of optimism that you have as a sort of, early 20s person. And it's nice looking back to see that things turned out fine. So you have all the optimism of a 20-year-old without knowing that things are going to be okay. And for me, fortunately, they were. And just thinking about what a sort of, just how much has happened in those last 35 years. So moving to London, which was always a dream as a kid. We used to come to visit the Natural History Museum. I don't know if anyone sort of is listening to this who had similar school trips. We used to, once a year, we came to the Natural History Museum. And this was back in the late 1970s where safeguarding wasn't the issue it is now. And we'd come down, we'd be dropped off at the Natural History Museum. The teacher would say, be back here at 3 o'clock.
Wonderful.
With an idea that we would be in the Natural History Museum for all that time. But we were there with some older kids who would go, come on, and we would just go out and about in London. And I just thought London was the most fantastic place. Yeah. So to be back here in near the first place where I lived, and just around the corner, and thinking about that, and being back in London, it's great. Yeah.
And when you were here 30 years ago, you had long hair.
It was a lot longer than, it's got long over lockdown, hasn't it? And but it was even longer back then. Yeah, I could actually tie it up.
Tie it in a knot and put a stick in it.
Yeah. Well.
So we're here to talk about outcomes for children, children's mental health, the impact of COVID on children's mental health. Just before we get into all of that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Healios, just very quickly. So I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at Healios. I've been here for 9 months. Healios is 8 years old, and it was founded by our Chief Executive, Rich Andrews. We provide digital healthcare solutions to children and young people with mental health problems. And we also have a neurodevelopment division, which works with children, young people and adults, where we assess people and we provide post-diagnostic interventions. And Healios has always been a digital company for all the years before COVID, so we're very well versed in using digital technology. So we do face-to-face therapy, like you and I, you still do, as clinical psychologists, and I used to. And we also have other digital innovations, apps, and we have a platform, and we've got a new website coming out in about 3 weeks as well, which we're very excited about. That's probably enough about Healios. So Duncan, would you like to talk to us about the impact that you think COVID has had on children and young people? And just for the audience, there will be a poll coming up on your screen that we'd quite like you to vote on, which relates to what Duncan's going to talk about.
I mean, it's people say that the word unprecedented has been used an unprecedented amount of time over the last year, but it's really true. It's had an enormous impact on all of us, and I think we don't yet know quite what the impact has been. It'll only be with hindsight that we look back and recognise it. A lot of it bad, no doubt, and for sure it's had a real impact on people's mental health, including children and young people. You know, it has been such a difficult time for so many people. I think it's been difficult for everybody. It's been particularly difficult for some. And when we experience difficult times, of course, that has an impact on our well-being. I think one of the things that, before we get into the more difficult stuff, it's helpful to, I think about some of the positives that have come out of it. And I think one of the positives is that people are now talking more about their mental well-being because of lockdown, and because people have, recognised that lockdown's had a real big impact on us. There's been an enormous environmental change. And I think that's led to people being much more open about how this big environmental change that's affecting everybody at the same time has had an impact on their own mental well-being. And I think that I really hope that conversation continues. And it will. The good thing about it is that people are talking about their mental well-being, and they're recognising that it's changed, worsened in most cases, but some people have seen improvements in their mental well-being because of a big environmental change. And I think that really challenges the old biomedical model of mental health, which, that people haven't had some sort of change in chemical imbalance because of lockdown. It's the environmental impact that's impacted on people's mental health.
Do you remember at the beginning of the COVID lockdown that there was a kind of elation, wasn't there? A lot of people were delighted that they didn't have to commute, that everything was very convenient, that they could be at home and wear their slippers under their desk and go out into the garden for a meeting, and how life was easier somehow. There was definitely that at the beginning for a lot of people. And then the kind of the cadence of the impact has been quite interesting, hasn't it?
Well, because at the start of lockdown, we didn't know how long it was going to be for. There was a bit of an idea that it would be for, some weeks and then it would all be over. And I think for some people, some people really revel in change, don't they? It was an enormous spanner in the works. And for some people, that's good. Some people like that, but for others, that's just disastrous, and it had a real disastrous impact on lots of people's lives. And again, we didn't know at the time just how long it would go on for. We still don't know, or just what the impact would have. And it's great. I guess with the first lockdown, when the schools closed, there was probably a lot of elation from the kids, thinking this is brilliant. We don't need to go to school. But that soon turned into sort of real worry and anxiety about, how is life going to be different? And people, as time went on, I think really started to think about their future. And for lots of kids, school is a safe place for them. And suddenly they were not in that place where someone was, frankly, looking after them while they were there. And that is really anxiety provoking. And I think that's one of the things that's probably had quite a big impact on certain groups of young people. In fact, we know that what COVID seems to have done, it seems to have amplified mental health problems. So young people who already had a mental health problem, for majority of them, we think it's got worse.
Yes.
And that's, so it's made everything sort of bigger where there was already a problem. We also know that for the kids who've been more affected, that it's not been distributed fairly. Like mental health problems aren't distributed fairly. So kids who were from more socioeconomically challenged backgrounds seem to have suffered more. Kids who were already in sort of difficult circumstances, so kids who were from living in households that were already challenging, seem to have got worse. But the ones where it's also interesting to think about, there seems to be some kids that have mental well-being has improved during lockdown. There's a group of kids who are saying, actually, I feel a lot better. And that'd be really interesting to look back at that and think, you know, what's that about?
And how long will it last, I suppose, the good and the bad impact?
Yeah. It's impossible to know, and I suspect the ones that have had the good impact are the ones who it's short-lived now. The schools are reopened, and I think we've really got to ask ourselves questions about what is it about schools for some kids that they're not the safe place that they ought to be. They're not a sort of a place where people feel comfortable, and you've got to feel comfortable enough to learn, but they're kind of rather the opposite for some group of kids. And I think that'd be a really interesting thing to look back at and try and understand how schools and just the lives of young people are just not good for young people's mental health, or a certain group of young people's mental health.
So we thought we were going to be able to launch a poll, but apparently the poll system's not working. So instead, if people want to post what they think the impact of COVID might have been on children and young people, you might want to say you think that the increase in prevalence or presentation for children and young people is 20%, or you might think it's 40%, or 80%, but we'd be really interested in hearing from you. We'd like your estimates of the impact we think this might have had. And I think the data that's come out from the Children's Commissioner suggests that there's been a 20% increase in emergency admissions for children due to the impact of COVID on their mental health. And between April and December last year, about 80,000 children and young people above what we would expect presented to children's services, children's CAMS services. What do you think, Duncan? Do you think there's been an increase in prevalence? Do you think there's been an increase in presentation? Do you think we're talking about, you know, what's going on here? What's the truth?
Okay, what's the truth? We don't know. And I think it's way too early to say, but we definitely need to reflect on that. So I guess those figures they're an enormous tick up from where things were pre-COVID, but they're, again, sort of this idea that COVID sort of amplified things. I think that, so the trend in presentation to emergency service, to A&E, that was already on the rise, and particularly for certain groups of people. So young women were presenting more, and actually the younger age group, so the kids presenting with self-harm, has got younger and younger in terms of their presentations to A&E. So that, again, might be an amplification of that. And in terms of the presentation to, or you know, the massive increase in people seeking help from mental health services, again, it follows a trend. So prior to COVID, we know that there was a big, again, over the last 10 years, a big increase in people coming forward and seeking help from mental health services. But what's really interesting, if you look at the prevalence data studies, so there was one, I forget what it was, a couple of years ago, and then one 10 years prior to that, which was a kind of screening of, you know, a population-wide screening, big sample of the population. And what they showed was that, for sure, there was an increase in mental health prevalence in the community. There were more kids with more mental health difficulties than there were 10 years ago. but it nowhere near explains the increase in demand. So there's been an enormous increase in demand, but according to the data, not an enormous increase in the sort of prevalence of mental health difficulties. Still heading in the wrong direction for sure. So what's that about? Well, again, we don't know for sure. I think there's some positives that I take from that. And one of them is that 10 years ago, I think there was not the same conversation about mental health difficulties as there are in young people now. So young people are much more savvy, much more open to talk about mental health problems, much more able to recognize a mental health difficulty and say, this is a mental health difficulty, than they did previously. So I think part of it is sort of recognition. There's something going on. People are recognizing that it's a problem, and people are saying, actually, I think this problem we can call this a mental health problem, and here's a place that you can go which might be helpful. I mean, I was just talking about, at the beginning about reflecting on my sort of life story, I guess. And as a 13, 14-year-old, anyway, as an adolescent, I had a mental health difficulty. I had what I now know to be an anxiety disorder. But I had no idea that that's what it was at the time. And neither did my parents, neither did teachers, neither did the paediatrician that I was taken to.
So you did talk about it a little bit.
Well, I knew there was a problem, but nobody knew what the problem was, and nobody sort of said, actually, this is an anxiety disorder, it's a mental health problem, and these might be the sorts of people who might be able to help you. I mean, that's sort of 40 odd years ago now, but I think that's part of a trajectory that young people and society are recognizing what sort of a problem it is and who might be able to help. And I think it's also about reducing stigma. So again, I think young people are more, I think, in my experience, more open to talk about mental health. And I mean, this is something I've not shared for, only recently I've started talking about this. And certainly when I went for my, the trauma of going for your clinical psychology interview, I chose not to mention it there. It just didn't feel safe to do so, whereas I think now I'm very comfortable to talk about it.
Yes, yeah. And I suppose, how many years ago did you start looking at how to measure outcomes when we intervene and try and support children with challenges?
Well, I think it's 20 years ago this year that a group of us sat down and said, we can see what's happening in teaching, that there are measures being introduced into teaching which teachers have had no part in what they were. It's a real sort of top-down thing. And we sat down and said, actually, we can see this coming into mental health, and it's no bad thing that we measure our outcomes. But we wanted it to be clinician-led. We wanted it, and interestingly, even then it was clinician-led. I think, given my time again, I'd say I want it to be young people-led, but then it was clinician-led. This was 20 years ago. You've got to forgive us for our own development. Then we sat down and said, we should do this, and what should it look like? That was the start of it.
Yeah. And I remember being on clinical psychology training about 25 years, 30 years ago, and the idea of measuring an outcome was really quite controversial. There was the whole debate about you can't measure it. There's a quantitative way of doing this, and that's a big debate we could get into, but I don't think we want to get into that one today. What we did talk about before the interview, when we were just having a chat, was social media and how that is often talked of as a cause of mental health difficulties. But I think what you've also just reminded us of is that social media might help children talk. Maybe it's a safer and easier way to talk. Maybe that's how come the conversation has got bigger.
I mean, I was thinking about again, so much has changed in this last year, but not much before COVID. There was the real concern about screen time and young people, and that it was a dreadful thing. And I remember having conversations with other mental health professionals who said we should just ban social media, and they were serious about it. And yet now, over this last year, you know, hundreds of thousands of kids have had thousands of hours of screen time, and okay, there's been an increase in mental health difficulties, but I don't put that down to the screen time. It's about how we use these new technologies, isn't it, to make them positive rather than sort of amplifying the negatives.
So I think we're having some questions coming in.
Okay.
So let's have a look at the screen. So interestingly, people think that the prevalence or presentation of children's mental health or mental illness has increased by 40% and 80%. Those were the estimates people have given us. And higher instances in complex cases. And that, I guess that's borne out by the emergency presentations that we've seen increase.
Yeah. But also the reduction in services. So services had to make an enormous shift from face to face and being set up to that, you know, to going digital.
Yes.
And it paralysed lots of services that weren't ready to do that. I mean, you know, so I suspect that also meant services were less accessible. So people had to find a way of getting help somewhere.
So if we think then about outcomes in children's mental health and what you measure and what is measured, and when you and I have talked about this before, we've talked about the kind of onion approach where right in the middle we might be measuring the efficacy of the therapist and the therapy, and we get quite preoccupied with that as clinicians. And then we've talked about something that we call in the business the stress diathesis model, which means the biopsychosocial approach, which you touched on earlier. Biological causes, social causes, childhood attachment, the way you were brought up, your resilience, your coping skills, that's one layer of the onion.
Yeah.
Then we talk about health inequalities as well, so the kind of the global economic situation, or the regional economic differences and different kinds of poverty.
Yeah.
And I wondered where you would like to start with the onion.
Well, I'd like to start in the absolute centre of the onion, which is about preventing mental health problems in the first place. And I think that it's an undervalued, under-researched part of what we as psychologists, mental health professionals in general, can apply, you know, good evidence-based approaches to, and also in terms of measuring outcomes, collect the evidence for what actually works on the ground, because preventative mental health is still, I mean, I think and I hope that mental health interventions generally are in their infancy, even though we've had 100 years of them, because I hope that things will get a lot better than they do. But one of the ways we'll do that is by, you know, innovating, trying things out, and then measuring whether they really make a difference or not, rather than just going, this is a great idea, we'll do that, and we'll believe that it works, or we'll gather some sort of anecdotal evidence that it'll work. You know, the past 100 years of children's mental health, it shows that, you know, interventions that are just driven on belief, okay, sometimes they lead to good places, but there are an awful lot of disasters that have been driven by belief, and we haven't really measured whether they're having the impacts that we expect. And that's by asking the young people and the families that we're working with or working for, whether, you know, has this had a positive impact on your life? So you know, that's the neglected bit of the onion, and we've been quite good at the next bit, or we're getting good at it in terms of measuring the outcomes of clinical interventions. We're still way behind other parts of health. So
yes, we are.
Oncology, cardiology, they're fantastically good at it. They're kind of close to the 100% of measuring outcomes of their interventions. In children's mental health services, we're lucky if we're getting 20%.
Really? So you think that only about 20% of outcomes are effectively measured for children and young people?
The data I've seen suggests that's the case. Now, whether that's a centrally held data by NHS Digital, there's probably loads more data out there that isn't quite getting to them, but we're nowhere near knowing in a sort of a kind of more of an objective way whether we're being helpful or not. Most of it, and this is not a bad thing always, but we have to have the counter of having something that's a little bit more objective. Most of it is driven by clinicians saying, yeah, I thought I did a good job there. And I take a pretty strong view that's not good enough.
Yeah. So some of the measurement of the efficacy of therapy that you've been involved with, some of the traditional therapies that we offer children and young people, like cognitive behavioural therapy. How effective do you think these things are? We might have a skewed sample of data, as you've just mentioned, but how effective are we being at the moment in the way that we measure things?
In the way that we measure things, or how effective are we in terms of
given how we measure things?
Okay, right. Well, not as good as the randomised control trials that suggest how good we could get. So one of the best ones in terms of where the evidence is around CBT and anxiety.
Yep.
There is, I think, pretty compelling evidence that a CBT approach for anxiety with a young person you're likely to get the best outcome. But even then, you're only likely to get about, for those kids you give CBT to who have anxiety, you're going to get about 50% recovery rate. So they go from having a problem to, at the end of the intervention, not having the problem. In terms of real world data, which is the bit that I'm more interested in, you get about 30% recovery rates. So kids coming in that would meet some sort of criteria for a mental health problem or a mental illness and leaving at the end of an intervention, below that threshold. And again, we get to all sorts of debates about how we measure that threshold, but we've got to have some sort of proxy measures. So there's either a suggestion that we can get better at what we're doing and get closer to that 50% rate or even higher. I mean, it would be great to get higher than that. But we also have to be realistic that, we're not going to get everybody better through, 12, 20 sessions of even the best interventions, the best evidence-based interventions. Because it's a bit arrogant to think that we would, because we see people, once a week, maybe once a fortnight, maybe a bit more but to think about that in the context of a child's life, if we could make that much difference on their lives, then, that'd be fantastic. But it can't. Therapy is really helpful. We know that it can be really helpful for some young people, but it's not life-changing in the way that the environment the child's in is. That's what really will change their life and improve their mental health.
So how do you see therapy changing or therapeutic intervention changing in the next 30 years?
Well, we're going to stick with digital, I hope, because I think it makes things, for some young people, it just makes things much more accessible, for others less so, but traditional mental health services we know aren't accessible to groups of young people. So I hope we keep that and we work out who are the kids that it really works for and who are the young people that it just doesn't. And I'd like to see us really expand how we see mental health interventions. So there's the traditional sitting in a room with a stranger in a building that's hard to access and talking to them for an hour a week. Sure, we know that has its value.
Yes.
But I think if we think more broadly about what a mental health intervention is and start thinking about how do we change the environment around the young person? So the responsibility for change isn't just on them, but it's for all the people around them. I'd like to see us go down that route, and I think that if we could really get sophisticated at measuring changing the environment and seeing the positive impact it has on mental health. COVID has shown us that you change the environment negatively and it has a negative impact on mental health. The opposite must be true, I think.
Yes. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through that I think pertain to what you're talking about around changing the environment. And of course, we've just talked about one-to-one therapy in a very sort of traditional way. But one of our audience has asked about how can multi-agency working be improved to enhance young people's mental health outcomes. So that's a bit more of a change in the environment.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, every government policy that's come out in the last 20 years has said multi-agency working, particularly with the most vulnerable group of kids who, for some of them, won't, and quite rightly, wouldn't come within a million miles of a traditional mental health service, but will still have links with other people. So the vast majority of kids go to school. Yes. Even really kids who really have big mental health challenges often still go to school. So if we think about the multi-agency as including school, it's who already has that existing relationship with that young person. And then if we think about how, as clinical psychologists, we don't just have to help by seeing a kid face-to-face or online, but if we can share some of that psychological knowledge with the person who's already got the relationship with the young person, we are making mental health services more accessible. If we can work together as agencies, and what makes it work? Well, agencies are made up of people, and what makes people work better together is conversations. So at some way, it's very simple, the answer, which is you've just got to allow people from different agencies to have conversations. You know, you put them in a room together. I'm a believer that you put people in a room together, good stuff comes out of it. Yes. But agencies are physically separated, and they're separated at a government level as well. Yes. So the whole system is skewed against what we really need to make things work, which is for agencies to get together and be able to have, sensible conversations around what's in the child's best interest, not what's in the agency's best interest, or what's my professional boundary, but what's really going to help this young person. Yes,
it has been a bit like the tail wagging the dog, hasn't it? The team leads the intervention rather than the child being at the centre of the intervention, and the team coming around it, sort of gathering around the child, and the team is a lot of different people.
Yeah. And that sort of argument, I mean, I've sat in lots of meetings, I'm sure you have as well, where the argument is this a mental health or a social care issue? It just completely misses the point. It's always both, and it shouldn't be, is it a mental health issue, therefore the mental health service should take it, or is it a social care issue, the social care people should take it? It should be, what does this child need? It should be formulation driven. Yeah. So how do we understand this problem this child has particularly? How do we understand the unique context that this problem arises? What do they need and want? And then you start to think, and who's the best person to do that? So let me just give a quick example that goes back to anxiety. So we know that half the kids if you give CBT, good quality, evidence-based CBT, about half will improve in a good way. What happens to the other half? Why do they not improve? Well, it's partly because for a group of them, they're presenting with anxiety because they're, have an undiagnosed learning disability, and they're in a school setting which just doesn't fit for them. The intervention isn't CBT for those kids. The intervention is you work out why they're struggling to engage in school, and you change the school environment for them. Same with kids with neurodevelopmental problems. It's not, a kid with autism doesn't need CBT. They need to have the environment around them change so that they can engage with the curriculum. And that's where I think we need to get a lot more savvy.
And you often talk about listening to the child's voice, don't you, and how important that is. How good are we at that?
Well, not good. I've learnt enormously, and some of it in a personally painful way, but sometimes the best lessons are a bit painful. About sort of, I suppose it's about my own arrogant professional practice, and I'm not bashing mental health training here, but I think any kind of profession where you're told this is the stuff you need to know, you know more than other people about mental health, which is kind of the subtext to certainly clinical psychology training and certainly psychiatry as well. That if you're told this is the good stuff, then in a trying to be helpful to a young person, we can go, well, we know what you need and we're going to give it to you because that's a really helpful thing. But unless we listen to young people, sometimes that professional superiority, that professional arrogance actually ends up being detrimental. We used to think that at worst, talking therapies did no harm. They might not help, but they won't do any harm. We now know that's not true. We now know they can be damaging. But by listening to young people, really listening to young people, saying, is what I'm doing here actually having an impact on your life in the way that you want it to change? Not, I think, you're not in school and you need to be in school and that's what we're going to do here. But what do you want to be really different in your life by engaging in some sort of mental health intervention? Let me give just another quick example, if we've time to do that, but about one of the lessons. So I was involved in a research project that was looking at implementing various outcome measures, not to measure impact, but as a sort of an intervention in their own right, that if we use these things, maybe they will improve how practitioners listen to young people. It's sort of feedback-informed treatment idea. And we set up, this shows just how arrogant professionals can be. So we thought it would be really good to set up the steering group would be a group of professionals working together with a group of young people and advocates to support them and help them have a voice. So we thought, great, we're doing this really good thing. And we were having a conversation once about, it was introducing the session rating scale. So at the end of a session with a young person, he sort of asked, how was this session? And we were thinking, when would we use it and when wouldn't we use it? When would we not encourage professionals to give out the session rating scale? And we had what we thought at the time was a really thoughtful conversation about, well, if it had been a really distressing session, it might seem a bit insensitive to hand out the session rating scale and say, how was this session? Because we know it's been distressing, so why would we ask? And if a young person had been, made a disclosure or something, that we wouldn't be right to do that. Or if we'd, we're doing some graded exposure that we know is unpleasant, but it kind of, that's sort of the point, we wouldn't do it then. We went on for about, 10 minutes, maybe longer. And we realized after this 10 or 15 minutes, it was just the professionals talking and the young people were sitting patiently, quietly waiting for us to shut up. And we paused and one of the young people said, have you finished? And we said, yeah, and we were feeling quite pleased with ourselves. Yeah, we'd had a very sensitive conversation. And we said yes, and they said, right, can we talk now?
Yes.
And they said, you were saying that you wanted to listen to our voice, and you've just talked as a group of professionals 15 minutes without recognising that we haven't said a word, and now we want to have our say. And we said, oh gosh, yeah, okay. Which was already a bit, yeah, we've not been done very well here. And they said, you were saying to us that these tools, particularly the session rating scale, is for our benefit. It's for your benefit. And you think that you're wanting to listen to our feedback on how the session's gone. So they said, so why should the professional decide whether we fill it out or not, rather than us? And I mean, looking back on it, it's a completely simple idea, but it just shows that how, even when we were trying to listen to young people, we completely missed the point. And they said, actually, if we have had a very difficult session, what we would like you to do as a professional is to say, we know it's been a really difficult session. Remember that tool that we've sort of handed out to get feedback from you every time we've met, sort of offering the invitation. Here it is, do you want to fill it out or not? I completely understand either way, but it might be really helpful to get some feedback about how it's gone, because we can learn from the difficult things. It was complete eye-opener.
Seems blindingly obvious when you say it.
I know,
doesn't it?
Yeah. And there's probably people listening going,
oh, for goodness sake.
How could you miss that? But I think if we're not open to recognising where we've tried to, and this was trying to do something well, but executing it really badly. So it was with a good intention, but done really badly. We have to be open to those sorts of helpful criticisms to improve in what we're doing.
I mean, that really talks to power dynamics, doesn't it? And I want to move us into the domain of one of the outer layers of the onion. Thinking about policy. There are quite a few questions coming in on how policy is influenced by outcome measures. So just thinking about, actually let's talk about the recent Marmot review that looked at the impact of COVID on mental health, and what does Marmot say? What does he think the policy should do? What would he say if he was
well, he's brilliant at talking for himself, so I wouldn't want to pretend to put words into his. I mean, I think for me the big take out of the Marmot report in terms of this update around COVID is, I guess, what I was echoing earlier about it's amplified inequalities that are there, and where almost wherever there is an inequality, it seems to have got worse during COVID, and that, I mean, there is the sort of one of the old adages around mental health that it's not a respecter of class or position, and okay, to some extent that's true, that anyone can find themselves struggling with a mental health problem. But what we know, and what was really clear in the Marmot report, the update, is that it's not fairly distributed. So young people, families who are in socially, economically disadvantaged areas are more likely to have suffered worse by COVID in terms of their own physical health and their mental health. The family, the young people, the people in the community they've been impacted much more negatively than those in more socially advanced, economically advantaged households.
And then there's the debate about absolute poverty and relative poverty, and if the poll system was working, we were going to ask you in the audience whether or not you thought relative poverty or absolute poverty had the greater impact on children's mental health and outcomes for children. But Duncan, what do you think?
Okay, we're getting into, I mean, we've been skirting around some dangerous territory. This is probably the more dangerous. It really, in my experience, it becomes political.
Yeah. So if we're going to stay away from politics and be empirical and look at the evidence base.
So the evidence that I've seen, and I'm we should always be cautious with any evidence that we see. We have to know where it comes from and how it's been collected, and we can't just go with the numbers. But I think there's quite a compelling view that it's the inequality that has the bigger impact on health, and there's some data that suggests that it's worse for everybody. So it's not just we know that the ones who are more economically disadvantaged have worse outcomes. That I think that's absolutely compelling evidence. But there's also some evidence that the inequality is bad for everybody. So that even those people, if you're living in a country where there's real inequality, the people who are the more socially and economically advantaged still have worse health outcomes than countries where there's more of a sort of equality. So the Scandinavian countries,
yes.
Great, in terms of equality, much better in terms of health outcomes, and much better in terms of, and I think this is what we really ought to be measuring, is about children's well-being across the board. And the Scandinavian countries do really well on that, and they tend to be the ones that are more equal economically.
Yeah. And in fact, I think it might be the Norwegian government that are just giving out money to families to kind of level up on relative poverty.
Right.
And I think you mentioned earlier that that's also happening in the US. We're not going to get political about it.
I think for very different reasons.
For very different reasons. But if the sort of Northern European countries have more equality of economics, and Britain and the US are sort of about 37, 38 on the scale.
We're way down the list in terms of children's well-being.
Yeah. So don't live in Islington, where we are here, or Camden. I think we might be in Camden actually, where the gap between the rich and the poor is large. And it's probably one of the highest density of therapists in the country here. That's probably not a coincidence.
Yeah.
One or two of the questions were around: does measuring outcomes influence policy effectively?
I think so, and I think it does in two ways. One is a good way, and one is a way that we need to be careful. So, what we measure becomes the thing that people try and hit as a target. There was I can't remember who wrote it. I wish I could remember it, but the quote from it is fantastic. It's called "Hitting the target, missing the point." And so, if we measure, so in mental health, if we just choose to measure symptom change,
yes.
and if we use a small set of tools, and I'm coming from a place where I think we ought to be measuring. We have a duty to taxpayers, but particularly to young people and families, that we do see whether, frankly, are we doing a good job? How we do it and how we get better at it, I hope we get better and better. But if we just measure symptom change on a narrow set of measures, services will focus in on just doing that.
Yeah.
And we'll probably see, we'll appear to see better outcomes, I would guess. But are we genuinely seeing better outcomes? So I think we need a range of things. And I'm a real advocate for client-defined outcome measures. The young people themselves saying, this is what I want to see improvement on. And so measures that ask, like the goal-based outcome tool, what is it that you want to see different? We're going to track whether we're doing a good job by what you see as different. I think if we've got a range of symptom measures, goal measures, and satisfaction measures, so you don't want to get a good outcome and it all being awful. But if we've got that range, then they sort of balance things out. And does it change policy? Well, it goes back to cardiology and oncology. They get loads of funding, and I think it's connected to how well they measure the impact of what they do. You can go, give us 50 million, and we will show you how that has improved services. You go to Children's Mental Health Service and say, give us 50 million. We can't really demonstrate the impact of that. And so it does have an impact on policy to our detriment, I think.
So one of the questions here on our screen says, how can we encourage more young people to be involved in clinical trials? And I think you've just talked to the fact that clinical trials can influence funding, can influence policy. So trying to get the children's voice heard in policy, maybe through clinical trials, maybe that's a route, as per our audience member suggesting. How do we get more children involved in clinical trials?
I'd be interested to know whether they mean as participants or involved in shaping clinical trials, and I hope it's, well, both. But we certainly need young people to be more involved in shaping clinical trials. And there are good organisations out there that encourage that. So I used to work with a colleague of mine, Kate Martin, who worked with an organisation called Common Room, who their existence was just to do that, to get young people to work alongside them, to make sure they had a voice in research and policy. And if you get the right the sort of the right organisation that can harness that energy and wealth of knowledge that young people have, it's sort of easy to get them involved. I think the problem isn't with getting young people involved in shaping research, it's with getting researchers interested and policymakers in really hearing the voice of young people.
Right, that's a good challenge. Thank you.
It is.
It's a very good challenge. Let's look at some more questions. We've got a few more minutes before we end here. And as we come to the end of the interview, I'm going to ask Duncan, and he does know this, 5 quick fire questions. So we've just got, maybe we can look at one more question on the screen here. So here's one. How can we engage with families more to support the care and interventions being provided to their children? Maybe we haven't worded that quite as it came out from the person, but essentially I think what that question's asking is, how can we help children and families engage?
I think it's you start with where they're at. You don't start with we've got this existing service and how do we drag people to it or slightly tweak it. I think if we really want to make a big difference, we start with where the families and the communities are at. And organisations like MAC UK have done a fantastic job doing that. What you end up with is something that looks really quite different from what we've got now. But I think that, again, it gets down from, if we're really interested in engaging, particularly those communities that don't traditionally engage with children's mental health services, then we've got to go to them and start with where they're at.
So where are children at? What are we missing?
Well, I mean, some of it is where we see young people. We see them in places that are nice for professionals and not particularly child-friendly. And I don't mean painting a wall orange is what makes the difference. But, young people have places that they feel comfortable in. Sports settings, youth clubs. For some people, it's school, hanging out on the street. There are loads of places where young people feel comfortable. If we could find ways of engaging with them where they feel comfortable, I think that again, it's not instead of the services that we have. It's kind of as well as, or it might be doing less of the traditional thing and more of that. I'd be really interested to see in future years the impact that it's had.
Yes, absolutely. So let's go to the quick-fire questions.
Okay.
So you've got 60 seconds, more or less, for each of these questions. What is the worst or most memorable question a child who was your client, patient, ever asked you?
The one that stands out is a young person with an autism spectrum disorder who I saw right at the end of a day, and this question was, why have you got that stick in your hair? And I remembered brushing past
This wasn't when you had long hair tied up in a stick.
No, it was a real stick, just kind of stuck in my hair that had been there all day. And of course, all the other kids and families and my colleagues, they've all been really polite and nobody had mentioned it, but the neurodiverse kid knew it was fine to sort of just ask the very straightforward question, why is it there? And
You've remembered that?
I remember it was there from the morning when I walked through
being a bit tall.
under a tree.
Yeah. Walked under a tree. Okay. So your second question is, what do you think of outcomes-based commissioning?
Okay, the 60-second answer is we should be commissioned on outcomes. We should be commissioned on, do we actually make people better in a way that they want to, do we improve their lives? The long question is, how do we measure that? What does that mean? What are the perverse incentives in outcomes-based commissioning? That's a whole other hour at least.
Cool. Well, we'll do that next time. Of the £500 million the government have committed post-COVID for the mental health recovery programme, they've committed 15 million to levelling up the economy, to our point earlier around relative poverty and the impact that has. How would you spend it if they gave it to you, if you were the commissioner?
I would start by working with the people who've already got the relationships with those young people, and I would think about how do we share mental health, psychological knowledge with those people who have already got that relationship, because they're the ones who are more likely to have a positive impact on those young people. So teachers, teaching assistants particularly, I think I would focus it there.
Okay. Fourth question. Are your nerves increasing or decreasing?
I'm trying to think. I can't remember all 5 of these questions, but let's see.
That's not the question. The question is, how do you look after your own mental health?
I probably, like most people, in good and bad ways. So the bad ways are I'm really partial to a glass of whiskey, probably more than I should for my mental or physical health. The positive things are family and friends, and they are really important. It sounds cliched, but I mean, they are the things that they probably have more impact on our mental health than any therapist ever would. Well, for sure. And I run a little bit, but that's to kind of stay alive. But the impact that's had on my mental health, I can't tell you. It's been fantastic.
You'll have to measure it. And the very last thing before we finish today, and thank you, is just to let everybody know that Duncan has kindly agreed to donate his fee for tonight to a charity of his choice. And that's a great precedent, so we're going to do that whenever we have a Spotlight interview. So thank you for doing that. Would you like to tell us very quickly about the charity?
I should probably start by apologising to all future people who join you on this lot, that they now feel obliged to donate to charity.
They'll feel good.
The charity I'd like to give it to are called Hearts and Minds. They're a London-based charity, and they are run by a remarkable young woman, Beth Ingram, who I've worked with over the years, and they offer peer-to-peer support for young people. But the thing that I think they really do well, and Beth does it fantastically, is to challenge mental health professionals and mental health services and keep us to account. And I think we need more people who can challenge us and question what we do and how we do it. And the more young people with lived experience that can do that, I think we all win from it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you for joining us this evening. And look out for our next Healios Spotlight next month. Good night.
Thank you.